Ina Kanuer did not lead a life filled with luxury. She and her boyfriend, Steve Riley, lived a modest life, often struggling to afford even the most basic necessities. Their financial challenges were a constant source of stress, forcing them to rely on the kindness and generosity of Steve's close friends. Despite these difficulties, Ina and Steve had a relationship that had endured for over a decade, built on shared dreams of a better future. By September 2023, their lives seemed poised for a dramatic change. The couple had begun to make ambitious plans, fueled by the promise of financial security. They talked about paying off all their debts, a burden they had carried for years. They dreamed of taking a well-deserved vacation, a rare luxury they had never been able to afford. Perhaps the most exciting part of their plans was the idea of spending time at Steve's ancestral family castle in Ireland. The castle, a symbol of wealth and history, seemed worlds away from their modest apartment in Minot. Tragically, Steve Riley would never live long enough to see this dream come true. Today's case is as strange as it is tragic. What makes this story even more bizarre is that the most compelling evidence against the accused comes from the suspect herself. Let's take a closer look at the events that unfolded and the unanswered questions that remain. The Minot neighborhood where Ina and Steve lived had its fair share of drama. Police were no strangers to the area, and their apartment, 912A, was no exception. Although neither Ina nor Steve had a significant criminal history, their apartment was frequently visited by officers responding to various incidents. On September 3rd, 2023, at around 4 a.m., the Minot Police Department was called to the area due to a disturbance involving a man named Chad. According to witnesses, Chad had a confrontation with Steve Riley that ended in a physical altercation, possibly involving a headbutt. Following this incident, Steve left the scene to cool down, leaving Ina to deal with the arriving officers. When the police questioned her, Ina provided details about the confrontation, but quickly shifted the conversation to another topic: Steve's impending inheritance. Ina seemed eager to discuss the couple's future plans, emphasizing that Steve's lawyer was scheduled to meet him later that day to finalize the transfer of millions. She explained that their financial struggles would soon be a thing of the past, and that they were already planning their next steps. While the officers remained focused on the incident with Chad, Ina's repeated mentions of the inheritance and her optimism about the future struck them as unusual. The officers eventually located Chad, who had sustained only minor injuries. With the immediate disturbance resolved, they left the scene. But just 2 days later, many of the same officers would return to 912A, this time for a far graver situation. Steve Riley's health took a sudden and alarming turn on the very day he was supposed to meet his lawyer. That morning, he had spent hours working on his truck in the garage, preparing it for a long-planned trip to visit his son in Texas. By the afternoon, however, his physical condition deteriorated rapidly. He collapsed at the airport, unable to meet the lawyer as planned. Steve's friends, Billy Burkhead and Wes Turson, were with him at the time and helped him return home. Ina tried to care for him, applying cold towels and ice in an attempt to alleviate what she believed was heat stroke caused by his morning in the garage. Despite her efforts, Steve's condition worsened as the evening progressed. Later that night, Steve's friends made a second trip to the airport, hoping the lawyer's delayed flight had finally arrived. Once again, they found no sign of him. Meanwhile, Ina contacted paramedics, explaining that Steve had been drinking earlier in the day and had not consumed anything else since the early morning. Tragically, Steve passed away just hours after his admission. Even in the wake of Steve's death, Ina's focus on the inheritance remained a central theme. Her repeated mentions of the fortune, combined with the mysterious circumstances surrounding Steve's sudden decline, raised questions for investigators. How could a man in seemingly good health deteriorate so quickly? And why did the long-awaited inheritance never materialize? As the investigation unfolds, the events leading to Steve Riley's death remain shrouded in mystery. Was his demise a tragic accident, or was there more to the story than meets the eye? September 3rd, 2023 was the day that Steve Riley had been waiting for. For months, Steve had been anticipating the arrival of his inheritance, a sum that would transform his life and the life of those closest to him. On the morning of that fateful day, Steve was in good spirits, feeling hopeful about what the future would bring. Billy Burkhead, one of Steve's closest friends, was with him that day and found it difficult to believe the story that Steve had been drunk. In fact, Billy never saw his friend drinking that day. He also didn't believe Steve had suffered from heat stroke, as initially claimed by Ina. Billy knew there was more to the story, and he wasn't about to let things go until he got some answers. Billy made the decision to call the Minot Police Department once again, hoping to clear up the confusion surrounding Steve's condition. He felt strongly that Ina's involvement in the situation was questionable, especially when it came to Steve's greatest possession, his truck. Billy was determined not to let Ina get her hands on it, fearing that she might sell it or take advantage of Steve's death in other ways. He was suspicious and worried that something was off. Billy's concerns were clear as he spoke with the police. "Just keep her from selling all his stuff," he said. "I'm almost sure she poisoned him." When the police asked him for more details, Billy explained that he and his friends had been with Steve the day before his death. They had gone to the airport together, only for Steve to fall ill soon after. That evening, he was helped back to his apartment, but something didn't sit right with Billy. He suspected foul play, and he wasn't going to leave until Steve's death was thoroughly investigated. Billy explained further, saying, "Wes came by the next day to check on Steve, but Ina wouldn't let him in. She claimed Steve was at a clinic getting treated, but Wes quickly discovered that was a lie. Steve was still in the apartment, gravely ill." Billy had tried to get answers from Ina, but she was evasive, refusing to explain Steve's sudden decline. The liquid was later confirmed to be antifreeze, a deadly substance when consumed in large amounts. Antifreeze is often used in poisons because of its sweet taste and colorless properties when diluted. It can be easily mixed with drinks, and it seemed that Steve had been drinking it, possibly not realizing the danger. It was strange, however, that the antifreeze was found in plain sight, as though Steve had been drinking it openly and undiluted. When Ina spoke with detectives, she was not yet under arrest, but the investigation was well underway. She explained that she had been unable to make progress with Steve's inheritance and was frustrated that the lawyer had not contacted her. This only fueled the investigators' suspicions, as they were beginning to believe that Ina might have been trying to manipulate the situation for her own benefit. Ina's story shifted when she was questioned about Steve's behavior in the days leading up to his death. She claimed that Steve had drunk almost an entire case of 24 beers on the morning of their trip to the airport. However, toxicology reports showed no alcohol in his system when he died, leaving Ina's explanation in question. Ina was adamant that Steve had poisoned himself, suggesting that he had done so after growing frustrated with the lawyer's failure to deliver the inheritance. She speculated that Steve had drunk the antifreeze in desperation, perhaps as a last-ditch attempt to solve the problem of his missing inheritance. Despite her claims, the evidence pointed to foul play, and investigators were starting to piece together a chilling picture of what had really happened. When the lead detective was briefly called out of the room for a consultation, Ina casually speculated that perhaps Steve had accidentally poisoned himself. She explained that around 6 months, maybe a year prior to the current incident, Steve had unintentionally consumed a dangerous liquid from the garage. However, her version of events appeared increasingly vague, with continuous changes in the details she provided to the detectives. The detective, now more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the situation, compared her version with the statement she made to the paramedics who responded to the scene. Initially, Ina had claimed that Steve had been drinking alcohol until 5 a.m., the morning of the incident. But now she was downplaying his drinking habits and shifting her story. The detective, sharp and focused, asked probing questions, noticing inconsistencies in her account. "How could you be so certain of the timeline when it clearly doesn't match up with your previous statements?" the detective asked, clearly unsatisfied with her answers. Ina tried to deflect the pressure, continuing to change her explanation. However, each new answer only seemed to make her more suspicious in the eyes of the investigators. The detective grew more precise and pointed out discrepancies in her statements, particularly regarding Steve's whereabouts on the day of the incident. Ina had stated that Steve had been at the walk-in clinic, but the timeline contradicted her account. The ambulance had arrived before Wes, a friend of Steve's, showed up at Ina's house. The timeline had proven that Steve had been taken away by the ambulance just as Wes was arriving. The detective, meticulously piecing together the details, presented these contradictions, but Ina refused to accept the weight of the evidence. She seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge the truth, despite the clear evidence before her. "I was just trying to help him, but nothing makes sense now," she muttered, her voice trembling. When the detective pointed out these inconsistencies, Ina seemed perplexed, but she tried to remain firm in her version of the events. She continued to claim that she didn't know what had happened, but became increasingly evasive, which only raised further suspicions. She repeatedly said, "I just don't know what happened. I really don't," as though trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Her demeanor seemed increasingly defensive as she sensed the tightening net of the investigation around her. Eventually, the detective decided to halt the interrogation, and Ina, resigned, requested a lawyer, thus ending the conversation. She had realized that her tactics of evasion and shifting blame had failed to distract the detectives from the truth. Despite the evidence and contradictions in her statements, Ina wasn't arrested immediately. For days, she continued to profess her innocence, but her claims grew increasingly bizarre and contradictory. She initially argued that Steve had intentionally poisoned himself, believing that he had been tricked by his lawyer, Richard, whom she described as a fraudulent person. Then she suggested that other people, like Billy and Lynn, could have poisoned Steve, calling them malicious and dangerous individuals. But once again, her statements only led to more questions than answers. She also began making far-fetched claims about other supposed people who might have been involved. Her actions only seemed to reflect the growing paranoia that she was feeling. Additionally, Ina spoke of a supposed poisoning incident that had occurred months earlier, but she couldn't provide any evidence to support her claim of ever being pregnant. She stated that the alleged poisoning had resulted in a miscarriage, but there were no findings to support this assertion. Her claims seemed more like attempts to justify herself, divert the investigation, or cover up her responsibility in the crime. It appeared as though she was desperately grasping for any excuse to explain away the situation, even if those explanations seemed entirely unfounded. When the case eventually reached the courtroom, 6 months after her arrest, Ina pleaded guilty as part of a plea deal. Steve's family, however, continued to grieve for their loss. During the hearing, Ryan, Steve's son, read an impact statement expressing his deep sorrow over the death of a father he had recently reconnected with after years of separation. She likened the house they had lived in to a reflection of the toxicity and squalor of their relationship, calling it a dump, both metaphorically and literally. The imagery she used vividly conveyed her disgust and anger toward Ina, who had caused irreparable harm to her brother's life. The case, one of the strangest and most complex ever handled by the Minot Police Department, concluded in October 2024. Authorities clarified that Ina's belief about a large inheritance was entirely unfounded. Her behavior suggested that without Steve in the picture, she might have had access to a substantial sum of money through a supposed common-law marriage that, in reality, did not exist. The detectives thoroughly debunked her belief that there was a $30 million inheritance at stake, and the investigation revealed that no such windfall was forthcoming. Her obsession with an imaginary inheritance, fueled by her misguided beliefs and manipulations, led her to commit a crime that tragically altered the lives of Steve and his family. Ina's delusions about the money and her false sense of entitlement seemed to have driven her to take drastic actions. Ina was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in prison, with another 25 years suspended. The story of Stephen Riley ended in a tragic and dramatic fashion, but justice appeared to have been served. Though his family continued to mourn his loss, there was some comfort in knowing that the truth had finally come to light. While the justice was late in coming, it brought a sense of closure to those who loved him. Steve's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had cared for him, even as they came to terms with the tragedy of his untimely death. His family, though devastated, had some solace knowing that the person responsible for his death had been held accountable. If this journey into the depths of crime has kept you on the edge of your seat, please join our community. Subscribe to the Into the Crime Depths channel, where we explore the darkest and most mysterious cases. Leave a like to support our work, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of our upcoming investigations. The truth is out there, and together, we will bring it to light.